Hello and welcome to Bastionland Broadcasting, where today we're going back in time, before there was Bastionland. There was a bastion, but no land, so to speak, certainly not under that name. We're going to be doing a deep dive in the style of the one that I did for Electric Bastionland, although hopefully not as long, because that ended up being about 9 hours of video. I'm hoping we can get this done in maybe 1 or 2 streams. It's going to be a deep dive into the Odd, which is the game that came before Electric Bastionland and is very much the sort of people have stopped asking me now, but when it was in development, people used to say, is this like a sequel or is it a new edition of Into the Odd, is the big question I would get. And the relationship between Electric Bastionland and Into the Odd, I still don't quite have it like hammered down. Obviously the practical realities are that Into the Odd is older, smaller, and the rules are very slightly different, whereas Electric Bastionland is much bigger as a book, has a lot more stuff in there as you would expect, and lots of, I think the main thing is the art and things like that. We were able to do a lot more than I could do with Into the Odd, but there is something about the simplicity of Into the Odd. And I don't even mean the rules. I think that the rules are very similar to Electric Bastionland. If anything, Electric Bastionland in some areas is actually slightly simpler, but it's the simplicity of the presentation that I think some people really like, is the fact that you've got everything you need in a kind of A5, I think 48, maybe 60 page book. So I'm looking at the chat because while I'm doing this today, any questions that you have about Into the Odd, obviously I'll answer questions about anything, but if it's about Into the Odd today, that would be great because we're going to be looking through the book, talking about that. So let's get on with it because we've got not a lot of book to get through, but you know how these things go. I always say they're going to take like 1 hour, and then before we know it, we've been streaming for 4 hours. So let's start here. So, Into the Odd. Yes, I know that this is the wrong way around, and the images should like tessellate here. But yeah, we have our fantastic cover by Levi. And the brief for this cover, I think the game, the indie game, what's the word I'm trying to remember? Limbo. At the time it was for Xbox 360. Limbo, I think, had come out. I think this is one of those things where it was like coincidental, where I hadn't really played Limbo, and then I think I played Limbo shortly after this cover was done. And I was like, oh, right. It's very similar in style, the kind of silhouette, and even the sort of big water wheel is a feature in that game. But yeah, I think I went to Levi with the brief of, could you make it look like a side-on, like cutaway dungeon that spells out Into the Odd, which I think is a tougher brief than perhaps I considered, really. And I think he managed it very, very well. And yeah, I still really like this cover. I deliberately wanted to do something very different for Electric Bastionland. Originally, I did think about doing like a series of books that follow this kind of scheme. So like obviously you'd have a red one, a blue one, and a green one for like 3 sort of connected books for the Into the Odd. The stuff that was going to go in there eventually ended up going into Electric Bastionland, so that stuff does exist, but I still think that would have looked cool. Sean F. Smith asks, as far as you know, has anyone run that cover as a dungeon? I forgot to bring it up with me. I have downstairs. Downstairs? Let me look. I think it's downstairs. I have a copy of the French version of Into the Odd, which is still a bizarre thing that I can't believe exists. But there is a French, like, super deluxe version of Into the Odd that has a load of extra stuff in it, in French, so it's no use to me. I didn't write any extra stuff for it. I just licensed them the game and said, okay, go. And I believe there is a French version of this cover as a dungeon. I think that's in there. I do have a hard copy of it, but my French is very poor. So I would certainly hope that somebody has run through this as a dungeon, because I believe it's included in the French edition. So before I get too far into the actual book, I wanted to go on a little bit of a history journey. We're going back to 27th of August 2011. What a time it was. I said that as a joke, and I genuinely got quite sad about thinking about what was happening in 2011 and what's happening now. So yeah, let's keep the mood high. But 2011, the golden age compared to today. I wrote this blog post saying that I'm thinking about mixing sci-fi in with fantasy, which sounds like super basic, but around this time I was still very much kind of discovering the types of games that I enjoyed and the types of setting that I enjoyed. I mean, the other things that I was writing about around here are very different to what I would do now. So it's over 9 years ago, and this was kind of the start of what would become Into the Odd, because I was wanting to mess around with this kind of sci-fi fantasy thing, and I hadn't yet got like a system in mind for it, but I knew that I wanted to do something in that vein. The obvious inspiration is Barrier Peaks, the old D&D adventure, which I never actually played, but I was very familiar with it. And then a couple of days later, I wrote about Project Odd, as it was called. And I think I've gone through this before on a video, so I'm not going to go through each of these step by step. But yeah, another month, another RPG project. This one is purely for personal use as much as for enjoyment of the... Hang on, this is before I was editing my posts, before I posted them. This one is purely for personal use, as much for enjoyment of the process as anything. Yeah, I'm sure this is going to come to nothing, Chris, of 9 years ago. So I still think these kind of core ideals, it's quite interesting because these do match up very well with what Into the Odd ended up becoming. So this would have been 3 years before it was released. So yeah, 2014, the print version came out, November, I believe. So so it's interesting to look through here and see sort of how close things were getting to Into the Odd already, just from the get-go. The first playtest was held shortly before September 1st. And to give a bit of kind of context here, I know must be some people that hate it when I say that I'm going to talk about Google+, because it's one of those really annoying things where, oh, if you were there, you'd know how amazing Google+ was compared to Twitter and other social media platforms. It was not perfect. There were problems with it, and there were problems that became even clearer later on. But Google+, this sort of community of people that were making things on Google+, is really what kind of spurred me on to make a game in this vein, because there were lots of people playing sort of OSR style variants of D&D, whether they were playing basic D&D or sort of like retro clones or things that took it a little bit further. And I knew that I wanted to do something that took it a little bit further. I knew that I didn't want to just play basic D&D, but I thought, can I keep it close enough to D&D that I can tell people, hey, do you want to come play D&D on Google+? Because we would then play on Google Hangouts. And I could say, yeah, we're going to play D&D. Yeah, we're playing my variant on D&D here. I'm calling it Into the Odd for now. So for a long time, it was very much presented as D&D. The first playtest, I believe the people that participated in this, or at least the people who participated in multiple playtests, or the first like mini campaign, they are immortalized in the credits, and I'll get to them when we get to the actual book. But yeah, it's interesting here. The one thing that I really did like about it was it took me approximately, so when did I say? So it took me about 3 days to remove the skill system from the game. So there was a very rudimentary skill system in there for sort of quite freeform, but having skills, and it lasted one playtest before I chopped it off. And yeah, I just thought we'd look at that as a little bit of kind of background. In fact, if you're going to indulge me, we'll come back to this one because that just made me laugh earlier. I have here a document from October 2011. So this was the playtest document that I was actually running the game from. I will get to the book. I know this is like massively self-indulgent, but we're gonna get to the book. Give me 5 minutes to wallow in my own past for a minute. And one of the things that's interesting about it is there is this focus on like mixing sci-fi and fantasy, which is, you know, it's stuck with the game throughout. There's lots of like, I'm not going to go over lots of little changes, like you'd roll ability scores slightly differently. But the thing that was really interesting in here is, this is a good example of like how I do game design. I don't know if a lot of games start with people making like a very solid core and then adding things onto it. I find mine is like the opposite. Like I will create what I think is a solid skeleton, and then I'll realize, oh, this arm, you don't need this arm. And like 6 ribs, no, take out 4 of those ribs. 2 ribs is fine. So there's lots of stuff in here that I had like where is it? There, power attacks were in there as standard. So every time you attacked, you had to say, are you doing a power attack or not? Disarming is just in there as standard rather than being something that's like there as a bit of guidance. A grappling system, that's how you know things are getting serious. And yeah, so there's just some weird things in there that got taken out. And the way that Arcana worked, it is much more like a spell book. They were like items that would contain spells, and you could kind of move spells around. You had to bond with your Arcanum. It was a bit fiddly. Like, I don't know what I was thinking, really. I think I was trying to reach that point where... Oh, and you had spell levels, I should say. You had power levels. And it was this way for quite a long time. And then I finally just thought, no, I'm getting rid of spell levels. We're going to have other ways of balancing spells so that some of them are more powerful than others. So yeah, this is probably this whole spell system is probably the thing that's been chopped the most over the years. So to get to Into the Odd, it got chopped right down. And then from Into the Odd to Electric Bastion Land, it got chopped down even further. So now it's just, you have this stick, and if you touch someone with it, they die. That's a bad example. It's not quite that, not quite, but you know, that would work. They are now a short line of description of what the thing does, and that's all that you need. Whereas previously, you're talking like paragraphs of information. And then before we get onto the book, the final thing I want to look at, I mentioned those people that were in the very first playtests of Into the Odd. This was edited on 2013, but I don't think this game was happening necessarily in 2013. I think this was a good deal before then. These are the original playtesting characters that were in the game. Ezekiel Stargazer, played by Michael Wolf of Stargazer's World blog, and I'm gonna mention everyone else's names when they're in the credits because I'm terrible at remembering surnames. But we've got Toku, who is one of the other characters that's also in the example of play. So those characters in the example of play are based on actual characters. And Hannah Steenbock, I believe, played in those first few games. Jürgen Mayer. And the thing that I like in here a lot is we've got the dead characters, because the game was a lot more deadly. Initially, I really wanted to lean into that whole like dangerous killer D&D style death trap, you know, Tomb of Horrors style difficulty. So there was a lot of characters that died. Uhtred died, but lives on in the example of play in the book. And Drumsticks was a dog. And this was the dog that made me realize I needed to put more animals in the starting equipment list. And that's why in Electric Bastion Land especially, there's so many pets you can start the game with. Because if you put like an animal in the group, it's like gunpowder. Like the players get attached to the animal. You can make the animal act in you can sort of control them in ways that you wouldn't be able to get away with for an NPC. You can use them to kind of lead characters in a certain direction, or you can use them to to get across the mood of a particular situation. You can get away with a lot with like a dog that you wouldn't be able to with like a human character that's in the group. Technoscaled. Was it really named for OD&D? Yes. So Project Odd was kind of ODD. Yeah, OD&D. It was like a very initial thing, and then I kind of immediately forgot that that's what I was doing. So I wouldn't read into it too much from like a mechanical point of view. It was really just a silly little in joke, and wanting to kind of get that. I hesitate to say simplicity, because in many ways OD&D is very simple. In many ways it's kind of complicated. But I wanted to tap into that idea of like the little books, that had everything you needed, like the little box set, but in one book. So, and drumsticks, I missed the key thing about drumsticks is that they got killed. And I will point out where they got killed when we get to the Iron Coral, because I remember it very clearly. So, into the odd. Let's go in. So, we've got some fantastic art in here from a number of artists, and layout by Jeff Russell. Obviously published by Lost Pages. Paolo Greco was instrumental in getting this sort of out in print. And it even has the historical address for my blog, which will still lead to bastionland.com. That's the old name for the blog. And the thanks here are for the 4 people who I think were the most regular playtesters here. So Jürgen, David, Hannah, and Michael. So yeah, here we go, into the odd. And I'm going to go back, because this here is... I think it's fair to like say this is my favorite piece of art in the book. This isn't any discredit to like all the other pieces of art in the book, but this one, which is by Jeremy Duncan, the inspiration for this, or rather the brief for this piece here, was I wanted the people to feel very small. And that's something that I remember, I think Alec, who did the art for Elect at Bastionland, will remember me saying the same to him probably, because I like the artwork when... I don't like the artwork when it's like a character there all heroic. That's not fair, because there are pieces in Electric Bastion that I do like that are kind of character focused. But I said for most of the art, I wanted the world to be the main character. And then, so Turd Theory says they never noticed the people. I think I was the same. Like, I think when I looked at this the first few times, I didn't really notice the people. Annoyingly, this isn't like a super high res version, but if you zoom right in, I remember when Jeremy was doing it, he said something like he thinks this is the most lines he's ever drawn on an image. There is a ridiculous amount of detail in here, and there's just like stuff in there. It's really great to look at. This is the one part of the book where I wish it was bigger than A4, than A5, because the A5 really doesn't do this piece justice. But the brief for this was I wanted a kind of nod to this piece here. Now, if someone's going to tell me where this is from, they're going to save me a lot of work, because I don't remember where I got this from. I got this from some kind of public domain art page. I'm sure it's from some old like sci-fi story, but I don't remember which one. And this kind of summed up what I wanted the mood to be like. There's 2 very small, maybe 3 very small, very like blank slate figures here. Not much detail on the characters. It's not about them being, demigods. These are ordinary people like you, and they're going into this weird place. And this kind of spherical structure thing was the inspiration for this. I said, can you recreate that structure? And he's gone crazy with it, but I'm very glad that it's there. This old version, I should say. This version was released under Creative Commons. It's no longer under Creative Commons, I should say. This version shouldn't be available anywhere. I think I've taken it down from everywhere that I had it hosted. But this was a kind of rudimentary version of Into the Odd. So a lot of it is kind of similar to what was in the final book, but you've got lots of public domain art. Some of it's probably not public domain. I would probably get in a lot of trouble if this were to actually get published. This was my own editing of taking a figure and making them look like a weird alien from an old painting, which is a trick that I quite like. And yeah, a lot of it is the same. I mean, I think that piece of art might be in the book, unless I'm wrong. The main difference here is you've got spells sorted by power level, but what I'm going to do is I might jump back to this old version, if that's not too meta, as we sort of work our way through here. Yeah, Captain Lucky Luke asks about it being available as a print. The problem is, like, I'm going to give you the really boring like answer now. I've been advised by people who've tried to do like prints of art from RPG books, and like a number of different people have told me like it's very difficult to make that viable to actually like sell. I know it sounds stupid, but like maybe when I can go out to conventions and stuff again, it might be something I can get like small amounts of art printed in prints and try and sell them on the day. But I think doing it as a business is tricky. Yeah, Gustave Doré. I believe a lot of the art is from their work. And I've seen lots of RPG books that do use the same pieces. So let's get on to the actual book. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through it, and I'm not going to go into every little bit of content here. If you haven't got Into the Odd, it is still available. It's at the moment available on print on demand or PDF on DriveThruRPG. If you go to bastionland.com, there is a link to a free version of the PDF that just doesn't quite have everything, but it has everything you need to play. So I'm not going to go over everything. I'm just going to pick up on the bits that I think are especially sort of noteworthy. And here, I really wanted to get the person reading the book to go straight from the contents into what they need to play the game. Whether they're a player or a referee, as this game calls it. And that is the same as in Electric Bastionland. In Electric Bastionland, I think after the credits, after the contents, I think like the first paragraph is saying who your character is and how to make your character. Because I would rather than get the player right into it straight away. That was the kind of goal with this. And again, this is where I started trying to do this thing where I didn't want to have lots of explanation of the setting. There is a bit of explanation in the setting in this book that crept in, but mainly I wanted a player to be able to look at this spread here and get an idea about the world. And that's kind of what carried across to Electric Bastionland, really. Let me hide myself so we can see just for a second, because really this tells you a lot about the world. And I know that I've harped on about this with Electric Bastionland as well, but the equipment list as a kind of setting tool is invaluable to me. So the main thing that I think got people excited about Into the Odd, those people that liked it, people liked the simplicity, people liked the auto hit combat, which I've spoken about before, so I won't rant on about that. But people like that. People like how quick your character was. So you know what? We haven't done this in a while. Let's make a character. No, actually, let's not do 10d6. That's going to be a little bit much. Let's just do our 3d6 at a time. So we would, if Electric Bastionland is WordPad, then Into the Odd is Notepad. That's the analogy I'm going to use now for people that ask me about it. Yeah, if you give me a choice of the two, I'm probably going to use WordPad, but Notepad is a valuable tool to have on your computer, and I wouldn't want to lose Notepad. So let's do it. We're going to make a character. Strength 11. We're off to a boring start, just how I like it. Wow. Dexterity 12. And give me an interesting will score. No, you're not going to do it, are you? So this is the rub when you're using 3d6 down the line. You are going to get these characters. And I'm going to explain in a minute why that's not all bad. At least I've got 1 HP. So I've got the comedy weakling in that sense. So I've got like kind of the worst character you could have rolled, because you've got no especially interesting bits of, like, you know, you're kind of dexterous but not enough, and you're not really bad at anything. So you're just kind of a bit of a blank slate schlub here. So what we will do is we'll look up our starter package. So our starter package is our highest ability score and our HP. So 11 and 1. Oh no, it's not 11, it's 12, sorry. So 12 is our highest score, and we have 1 HP. So that gives us a club, throwing knives, no damage score provided. I could pretend that's to like make people feel like they're making decisions early on about rulings, but I suspect it is because throwing knives is quite a long bit of text, so it wouldn't fit. Yeah, that's the level that we're dealing with here. It's going to be D6. You know, knives are listed well, dagger is listed in the hand weapons, so I expect you'll be able to work that out. And Arcanum. Well, I'm glad we got an Arcanum, because that's going to lead nicely onto that section. We're going to roll a D20 to get our random Arcanum, and that's our like magic item, I guess. Number 3. So they're going to have Arcanum number 3, and we'll get to that when we get to that section. But you've basically just rolled a character there. That's the idea. So that's why I didn't mind that your character could die quite easily, because you can very easily roll up a new character. And you know, each of these, it's tricky to get it in such a small space, but each of them was meant to suggest a background, but not prescribe that background. So the example that I always use, let me see if I can find it in here. So a pickaxe and some manacles. So manacles are a great piece of equipment for flavor, because there's 2 very obvious ways to go. Like, are they manacles you were bound in and you've managed to escape from them, or are they manacles that you used in your sort of background? So yeah, it's for this one that we've got club and throwing knives and an Arcanum. I think the nature of the Arcanum is going to give us a lot of flavor. But club and throwing knives, it's very kind of basic, rough, thuggish equipment. So I'm thinking some kind of like petty criminal, or like thug. So yeah, I'm very, very happy with this. I feel I don't like to like blow my own trumpet too much, but I feel like this is one of the better things I've come up with, and I've been trying to match it since. To be honest, I think it's a tough one to follow. Now, what I'm not going to be able to do as we go through this, unfortunately, is tell you who did each of these pieces of art, because I neglected to keep a record of which piece was by which person, which is terrible of me. But yeah, this is a cool piece of art here. Again, the characters are almost invisible to begin with, until you notice them, because your eye is drawn to this weird situation they're in. So yeah, you've got your rules on one page. So the rules are on one page, but then you've got like a little bit of an expansion there. So you might think, well, why is it that the rules here are on one page, but on Electric Bastionland it's 2 pages? Does that mean that Electric Bastionland is twice as complex? No, I think with Electric Bastionland there's like examples of play that are in there to explain the rules, and you've got that scars table which takes up like an entire column. And I've lumped in some of the stuff that is here, like detachments. That's all lumped into the same system. So even though there's a lot more text in the rules in Electric Bastionland, it's still a 2-page spread, and I don't believe it is any more complex really. It's just a bit more thoroughly explained. Character advancement is another one of the big things that was different, and this is something that I understand why some people prefer this. And this is the thing, like, Electric Bastionland is not intended to replace Into the Yard. It sort of replaces it for me, like in my home game. Like, I think I would always run Electric Bastionland rather than Into the Yard. But this is like a snapshot in time of how my games were at this time. And just because I've decided that I want to do things slightly differently doesn't mean that this is now like invalid. So the character advancement system here is a little bit more traditional, but it's still slightly different because you've got these kind of, again, I need to hide myself just so we can see it. You've got these kind of like experience levels that are reached by specific things. So it starts off very simple. So you start off as a novice. If you survive at least one expedition, you go up to professional. So, you know, if you make it back alive in the first session, you're going to get like a level up, which is, I think, quite a nice little end to that first session. It gets people excited about going back in. Expert requires surviving 3 more expeditions. Veteran is 5 expeditions, and you need to have taken on an apprentice. And this is the thing that kind of divided people, because it's quite specific, you know, saying you're gonna have to take on an apprentice. It's not something that you get as a standard thing. And then to get to master level, you need to get your apprentice. Yeah, you need to get your apprentice leveled up, basically. So that's it's interesting. I kind of like it. If I was going to do like a more traditional class-based game, I think I could see some merit in this kind of system where you've got very clear leveling up guidelines. You could use this as a nice way to differentiate classes. But for me, I just really wanted to try the whole foreground growth system of Electric Bastionland, where it's doing something that I've not seen many other games do, where your growth is just purely based on what you've done and what you find and what you achieve. You don't really get like an external, oh, you've leveled up because you've been playing long enough. There's not really external rewards like that. It's very much based on what you've achieved in the world. Like you've got a scar, or you've made some money, or you've made some contacts, or you've got a weird ability. It's not going to just happen between sessions, basically. This Enterprise and War section is weird. This is in there because it's kind of like a product of its time. I'm going to very loudly pour myself a drink. I make no apologies that vast swathes of this video are just me staying hydrated, drinking coffee and ginger beer. That's surely what you come to expect now from these streams. Like, if the ginger beer is not out, it's not a real stream. So this section is kind of like a product of its time, because at around this time, again, on Google Plus and on the kind of OSR blogs, everyone was really digging back into those old versions of D&D and thinking like, what can we revisit from here? Like what's been cast aside in perhaps more modern game designs that might be worth revisiting. And there was a lot of noise being made around, you know, D&D had a domain system where if you had a fighter, you would get a castle at a certain point. And if you were, I don't know, a druid, you'd like go and found like a circle of druids, I think. I wasn't too familiar with that side of things. I never really played a campaign that got that far. But it was kind of interesting to think about, and I liked it as kind of an end game that was there if people wanted it. So I had this system where people could like have an enterprise, because it didn't fit the theme that you were off getting a castle, because this is like the thing that I should have said. The other big thing that separates this from Electric Bastionland is the implied setting here is very much industrial era, sort of 17th, 18th century, a bit of 19th century. More 18th, 19th century, really, I would say. And then Electric Bastionland is very much early 20th century, primarily. Very loosely, I should say. So having a castle didn't fit with being like a 19th century style world. Instead, like having an enterprise made a bit more sense. And being able to like hire detachments and take big expeditions off. So like I liked the idea that later level play was very different to playing with a brand new character. So as you went on, it wasn't that you were becoming a powerhouse with like loads of different abilities, but you might have enough money to fund like a big expedition where you're taking like an army off on a boat to go and like take on a really, I guess, like a dungeon. As you can tell from the way I'm describing it, it didn't really work out much for me when I actually tried to test this out. The battle system is fine to use, just like, you know, it works okay. But I still don't know how I sort of fit this into the structure of the game, because, like you say, you get your army together, you go on a boat, and then what do? Do you go off and like you're having like a war? Because it all of a sudden it's like, well, why are we doing this? It's not quite so. There's not enough stuff provided in this book to support that, I don't think, and that's why I think if I could chop one page out of the book, I'd possibly chop this out. The one thing that I do like about it is it gives you a bit more. Bear with me while I choke. There we go. Gives you a bit more kind of setting in that you've got these ships and structures, and you've got these two sample characters, which I like. I really agonized over these. I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to cough very loudly. I'm going to mute myself and hide myself. Very sorry about this. I feel like I'm going to make it through the stream, and then I'm going to have to go and drink like a honey and lemon. So, as I was saying, these sort of sample organizations. I spent quite a lot of time thinking about how to make these two organizations tell you a lot about the world. So, the fact that this urine spinner character is the leader of the Black Star group. He has a revolutionary detachment, a distillery, and a smuggling ring. Those three things tell you three slightly different things about the world, and I'm especially happy with Queen Essa the Ninth. She's a deposed aristocrat. So she has her Royal Guard detachment, and a footman detachment, but she also has a reptile cult and a hidden vineyard, which again, it's sneaking in that kind of weird sci-fi stuff alongside the kind of moving towards the, I guess, like, again, like that kind of 18th century, you know, monarchies are perhaps drifting out of fashion slightly. So yeah, that's the one thing I do like about this spread. I remember this artwork. Anything that looks like this is from Corey Bryn. And this is really cool because I don't really even know. One of the things I like about it, this style, is you kind of see, it's a bit like a Rorschach thing, I guess, but like you kind of see what you want to see to some extent. So I'm not going to tell you what I think that is, but I like that it's kind of quite abstract. This piece really stuck with people. I had a few people ask about this guy with weird suckers or scars on his body and a marble head. But I think this is great because it's provoking questions about the world. So, Arcana. Now, what did we roll? We rolled Arcanum number 3, which is the Pale Flame. So let's see what we've got for our starting character before I look at these. So an object glows with white light. Contact with the glowing object causes a chilling pain. The glow wears off when the Arcanum is used again. So, glows and causes pain. Now, this is one of the ones that I'm actually slightly more happy with out of all these Arcanum. And again, this fits our idea as like this person's like maybe like a low-level thug, or like they're intimidating people with this thing that causes pain. So yeah, we've got a bit more identity here for our character, but I'm relatively happy with that one because it's interesting, and there's not much mechanical stuff in there. It doesn't do like D4 damage, or they have to make a strength save to resist the pain, or else they suffer -2 will. Instead, it just says that it causes pain, so you can use it in ways that you would use something that causes pain. So it's not meant to be a weapon. You're not going to kill someone with it. But yeah, you could use it to potentially torture someone, or you could use it just to there could be a number of situations where you might need to like cause pain to something but not harm them. That's one of the better ones. On the whole, these are a very, very mixed bag. And there's no secret news here about anything I'm doing with Into the Odd at the moment. There's nothing kind of happening at the minute with it. But if I were to like revisit this game and like reprint it or something, I would want to change some of these, because some of them are like, I look at them now and I'm like, oof, no, I'm like a little bit embarrassed about some of these. The one that I always remember is, I think the first like podcast that I heard talk about Into the Odd was the Smart Party podcast. And I've since done lots of things with Baz and Gaz from the Smart Party. But at the time, I'd not heard of them. I just saw somebody mention that these guys had done a read-through of Into the Odd, and they were going to do an actual play. And I remember it really clearly. I can like picture myself getting out of my job at the time, and I had the podcast downloaded, but I hadn't been able to listen to it yet. I remember listening to it and driving home. I am that vain. Like I will search for who is talking about Into the Odd and who is talking about Bastionland, because to be honest, there's so few people talking about my games that I can do that. If I was one of these high flyer Morkborg people or Mothership or all these sort of hyper successful games, then I probably wouldn't keep up with every little thing that was going on. But I've got just the right level of like people that like my games now that I can just like keep up with everything. And especially at the time, this was before Electric Bastionland was anything. So I was really excited. They sat down, they said, right, they read through the whole thing, and they were like, yeah, you know, it was largely a positive response. It was really fun to listen to. And then they said, let's roll up a character. So they rolled up the characters, and one of them got an Arcanum. And they were like really excited. They said, right, let's roll to see which Arcanum we get. And I already knew that there was one of these that I hated, because I thought this never should have gone in the book like this. This is like really rubbish. It needs fixing. And I was like, no, please don't roll that one. And yes, they definitely rolled that one. Technoscald has picked, inadvertently perhaps, the same one, which is the Heat Ray. So the Heat Ray is kind of obviously a nod to like War of the Worlds. And I like the theme of it. Like it sets the tone of like that kind of 19th century sci-fi feel. But all it is it's just a musket that ignores armor, and it's like the worst type of magic weapon. It's not really any better than like a +1 sword, and everyone like hates on +1 swords in D&D and says like, oh, it's so boring having a +1 sword. So the heat ray, I don't know how it got in this form. I think I was just enamored with the concept of the heat ray, and it's just boring because if someone's got, you're just going to use it like a gun. There's no interesting decisions to come from this heat ray. So it has been reimagined in Electric Bastion Land, and now it's much more interesting. Like it's kind of powerful in its own way, but it's not really a typical weapon. It's kind of like a thing you have to set up and use to like ignite a fire somewhere. But yeah, this is shameful. So if you are playing Into the Odd and you roll the heat ray, my official errata is, I think instead you should roll on the next page, which is sort of greater arcana. It might break your game, but who cares? In terms of these, I'm going to go through them very quickly, pick out some of the ones that I like and don't like. The space folder is very much there to... What is that? I think there's a phrase in like films called stunt casting, where you will hire like either a very famous actor in a bit of an unusual role, or like casting somebody in a very unusual role. So you might say, oh, have you seen they're making a film version of I'm trying to think of like a really silly example now. Have you seen they're making like a film version of Pride and Prejudice, another one, and Nicolas Cage is playing Mr. Darcy, and you would be like, that is some stunt casting, but I'm kind of interested now. Then this is a bit like that, because I liked being able to say to people like, yeah, so one thing is your character might start the game with a portal gun, and that gets people's attention one way or another, and it kind of sets the tone. Some of these are in Electric Bastion Land in slightly different forms. The ones that I don't like are the Soul Wrench is a little bit that's a bit weak. You know, they get to pass a save, and if they fail the save, they lose some will. It's just not very interesting. Gavel of the Unbreakable Seal, that's great. I love this sort of thing because it does a very simple thing, but you're going to have to be clever to use that in an effective way. The Red Oil Stave is obviously a reference to the grease spell. But because grease is like so good in D&D, especially like if you're running kind of a more freeform D&D, grease is like super useful compared to other first level spells. The fact that it disappears in a harmless flash if ignited is kind of its like slight balancing factor. Pain Sign, that's terrible. I don't like that one. Pass a will save or lose d6 strength, that's crap. That's like bad design there. I don't like it. Spider Skin's good. Some Blessed Bands is okay. So you're trading some like stealth for armor, but really, would you not just like take the bands off and then put them on when you get in trouble? I don't know. Flesh Tome of Babel is great because it changes the way that you can play the game. Might be my favorite because it's like when you unlock an ability in like I've got roguelites on the brain because I'm playing Hades a lot at the moment, and it's like when you get an ability or a new weapon that makes you play the game in a completely different way. This is like that because now you can talk to anything, like any living thing. So yes, you can talk to a tree. Sean Smith, it's a good job that I don't have Hades installed on my PC, because I would definitely do a terrible stream of me being bad at Hades. It's on my Switch, so I luckily can't stream it because nobody wants to see how bad I am at it, but I'm thoroughly enjoying it. Tyrant's Rod is pretty solid. I think there's a very similar version of that in Electric Bastion Land. And yeah, Miniaturization Coil has got some real hijink potential. perhaps too much hijinks potential, but can you really have too much hijinks potential? So you make it tiny, and you can restore it to original size at will. So what do people do with that? I think I've had several people say that they want to like shrink a boulder down to like a pebble, and then they throw it, and they want to like unshrink it as it's flying. And on the one hand, I want to say like, yeah, that's cool, go for it. But it becomes one of those things where it's a little bit too useful. Like, does that become your go-to thing? Speaking of being too useful, I'm sure we have all heard the story of the bone magnet and the GG No Read podcast by now, so I won't be repeating it. But the bone magnet is perhaps the item that inspired me to remove there was a rule in Into the Odd that didn't make it into Electric Bastionland, which was if you want to twist your Arcanum to do something slightly different to what it's meant to do, you can try and do it, but you'll need to pass a will save. That's fine if your will score is like 10, but if you happen to roll like a character with like 17 will, and you get something like the bone magnet, then you can be doing some weird things like breaking necks with it, and it just gets a little bit weird and a little bit too crazy. And I do like it crazy, but I like it to be crazy in an interesting way, and crazy in a way where you have to like think and be clever to work out how to make things work in that kind of way. I don't like it to just be default, you push a button and crazy stuff happens. Then we've got the big ones, the Greater Arcana and the Legendary Arcana. I'm just going to pick out a few highlights here. I'm noticing that I'm on page 13, and there's quite a way to go. So I'm going to say now that we're going to make this a 2-stream project. So I'm going to come back to this next week. We'll do a bit more now, but I'm definitely not going to get to the end of the book today. So it's been a while since I looked through these, so I'm going to have a quick glance through now and see any ones that particularly leap at me. What do I remember from here? The Wither Glove is lame. Again, this is like this kind of, make a save or lose an ability score. It's not interesting. Like, I don't like it anymore. We're better than that now. The Inferno device was my attempt to make Fireball more interesting, because again, when people were making these retro clones and revisiting early D&D a lot, Fireball was getting a lot of action, and there was lots of talk of like the thing that I never liked was this whole volumetric Fireball thing, where people would say, oh well, if you're in a tunnel, the Fireball will like not be a ball, it'll spread to fill the whole tunnel. I get it. If you were making a physics-based video game, then do that. There's that game, what's it called? It's a roguelite again. Noita, is that right? The kind of physics-based pixel roguelite platformer. That's all about like blowing yourself up in explosions because you misjudged things. But for a role-playing game where you're trying to describe the dimensions of the room, I think that's asking a bit much of your group to be thinking about how much volume of space this Fireball is going to fill. Anyway, people were like saying Fireball is like the essential spell. And I never liked direct damage spells, really. I always think there's a more interesting way of doing spells. So the Inferno device, you have to have a source of fire there already, and then you can make it explode. So in a world where lots of people are carrying torches and lanterns, it's still very dangerous, but you've got to set it up, if you like. Technoscald asks, how do you distinguish between the grades of Arcana? You should know by now there's no fancy system here. I think I just very loosely kind of split them up, split them into 3 tiers. I think that the Legendary Arcana, as you'll see, are kind of meant to be campaign altering things, so they're very obvious. The distinction between greater and lesser it's really just whether I thought, would you want a player to start with this, or do you want it to be like a kind of upgraded version? So yeah, the gate to beyond is fun. You just summon a demon. The black orb obliterates a man-sized object or man-sized or smaller object you touch. No effect on living tissue. That's kind of in a world where you might be fighting like non-organic, non-living creatures. That's actually quite ridiculous. The pressure needle is fun. I imagine like you prick them with this needle, and then the next sort of cut to them is just like an absolute blood explosion. And then the legendary arcana are ridiculous. So some highlights: the dead oak creates a 1 mile zone where any living things lose d6 strength each hour. So this is, people ask like, if I already have Electric Bastion, and should I buy into the odd? The obvious answer is yes, please. But the real answer is there are bits and pieces in here that you won't get in Electric Bastion Land. I mean, most of these arcana are unique to Into the Odd. But these legendary ones, I don't think there's really like an equivalent to this level of power in Electric Bastion Land, because it's so much focused on like what you can start the game with. So I don't think many of these are kind of represented in there. The weather altar, just change the weather within a mile for the rest of the day. The transformation chamber, change from the form. Black hole collider, you basically create the sphere of annihilation. It's totally not the sphere of annihilation if anyone from Wizards of the Coast is watching. And yeah, the Starbeam panel. The only source of D20 damage, I believe, in the book. So yeah, you can just call in an orbital strike, basically. Example of play, like I say, I'm not going to go through all this, but I really did try and... It's as much about presenting the tone of the game as it is about explaining the rules. So I knew that I wanted to have like certain rules in there for the example, like a little bit of combat. But I also wanted to have this exploration. So I don't think there's many like interactions with the rules. Like there's a luck roll here, and then it's only here when we start like dealing with damage. So before then, it's all about trying to express like the conversation of the game, show an example of how that would work. Examples of play are always kind of cringy. The really cringy ones have things like the GM grins as they clutch the dice and roll them, and they cast an evil eye over the table, and there's a lot of bollocks like that. But I do have like the players groan in unison, so I can't really talk too much. Like, it's very difficult to write them in a way that isn't kind of cringy while also doing the job of an example of play. So yeah, that piece of hopefully royalty-free art did make it into the book. Very slim bit here on running the game. Luck rolls are another thing that I know people were very keen on. I did not invent the concept of roll a die and hope that it's high, but I think at this time there were quite a few games that I think simultaneously did something similar, and I'm sure there were lots of games that did it before. I don't know where I heard about it, but I definitely heard about someone saying this as kind of a general rule for when the other rules don't fit, and I wanted to put that in there as kind of like an actual thing. Some guidance on creating encounters, and then the sample monsters, which are our first real, like, again, we're not really getting setting. I guess we're getting some setting here. Obviously, the Strange Hunter. I mean, it's a bit on the nose to say that he's got a shoulder-mounted gun and an exotic curved blade. Yeah, it's the Predator. And the Bone Crawler started out calling. It was originally called like the Ebon Crawler, or like the Black Crawler or something. And this was, driven to implant a host. It's a xenomorph from Alien. And originally I was much more like, we're blending sci-fi and fantasy. Let's just say you want to have xenomorphs in your game. And then I tried to tweak them a bit, so I was like, no, let's try and make this a little bit more. Let's try and have a little bit more of a straight face on this, so it's not a complete like pastiche. But it's very clearly the Predator and the Alien are in here. The rest are kind of like relatively unique. I don't remember where the influences came from for all these, but I knew that I wanted to not have a giant monster manual. I wanted to have examples. So it should say sample monsters, but it doesn't. Here we go. Yeah, the referee should use these examples as guidance for creating their own monsters, because I want you to make your own things. The thing that I like is that most of them, I think the majority of them, are kind of like not really able to be just fought in a traditional way. So the Dust Hag, physical attacks are impaired, and water-based attacks are enhanced. So you can throw a bucket of water over her, and it'll do more damage than a sword. But it's a puzzle. You've got to solve the puzzle. The Colossal Shell Beast is just massive, and if you're going to go and fight it head on, then you're not going to have a good time. The Beckoning Shadow is immune to normal attacks. But it's repelled by light. The Thing of Glowing Smoke is immune to normal attacks. But it can be repelled by wind or cold. And the Dead Echo, I think. The Dead Echo is like, does it even have like a physical form? Right, okay, yeah, the Dead Echo is just weird. So most of them aren't like monsters you would fight. They're like weird. So, I should have said one of the other inspirations, and certainly with the Dead Echo, is the SCP Foundation, which I won't explain if you haven't read about it, but it's kind of like collection of weird things. So yeah, the Dead Echo is obviously inspired by that. Treasure. So I've spoken before about treasure, and in Electric Bastion I really wanted to hammer home some like guidance for how to handle treasure. And here's a lot of the guidance is the same, really. The thing that I am a little bit ashamed about as well, I don't know, it's not too bad, but you've got the silver shilling, copper pennies, and the gold guilders, which is, I've since kind of decided that I've had it with like slightly silly fantasy coinage systems, and I've just got pennies and pounds, which I know is not the system everyone uses, but like 100 pennies to the pound, and you're mostly dealing with pounds. In Electric Bastion Land, you're not really dealing with pennies. It's very easy to grasp, but I think some people get too hung up on wanting to create a unique thing, and if you want to have like a really fantasy feeling world, then yeah, you might want to use something different. But here I've kind of tried to like sit on the fence, because I wanted to say shilling, penny, guilder, but also that they're just like 10. There's like 10 pennies to a shilling, 10 shillings to a guilder. So it doesn't have that kind of old currency feel where you've got like 18 pennies to a whatever. Like, so I would probably go back to having like just guilders and pennies, maybe 100 pennies to a guilder, something like that. The other thing that's on this spread is traps, and my opinion on traps has changed quite a lot. If you haven't heard me rant on about traps before, then in Electric Bastion Land, at the back in the Addendum, there is an article in there called, I think, 34 Good Traps, that talks about what I think makes a good trap, and most of these kind of break that rule. It's also on the blog, so if you go to Bastion Land and search for traps, you'll see like 34 good traps or something to that effect. there are some that I like. There's some that I don't like. So the thing in here is like, as a general rule, the presence of a trap or hazard is always noticed by characters unless they are running visually handicapped or distracted. So I've still got that kind of traps will present themselves, and traps are more of a puzzle or an obstacle rather than like a gotcha trap. But then some of them are like they're just a little bit less inspired than they could be. They're still fine. I like the strange nectar a lot. So it's a pool of honey-like liquid that smells delicious, but eating it causes violent spasms for a minute. An hour later, the character violently chokes up D6 thumb-sized yellow magnets. Maybe that's what I've got with this cough. Maybe I'm going to cough up D6 thumb-sized yellow maggots pretty soon. Have I still got my D6? How many thumb-sized yellow magnets am I going... magnets? Oh, just one. That's fine. I won't worry too much. So yeah, they're okay, these ones. I sound like I'm being harsh on the game, but you got to remember that like this came out 6 years ago, but for me, like it was already not old when it was released, but I'd been using it for a few years, and I kind of like sealed it off quite a bit before it got released. So it's kind of like old. It's like double old for me, and because it's my own old stuff, I always feel like when I look back at it, I'm like, oh, I wish I'd done that differently and that differently. Whereas Electric Bastion is still very shiny and new, so I'm still like, oh no, I'm happy with Electric Bastion. But I'm sure in 6 years I'll look back on that and think, I wish I'd done that differently. So yeah. And then, what's this? A page of fluff in one of my books. Disgusting. So this is the world of... It's not called Bastionland. It's just the Oddworld. Now, obviously, I'm very aware of the Oddworld games, Abe's Odyssey. And it's a shame, because the Oddworld would have been a nice little name to keep, but it's just too confusing with that. So, this is an interesting bit where this has changed from the old version. So let me dig out the old version. Because in the old version of the Into the Odd, there was the free states. The dozen states of the northern continent and their distant colonies have been united for over a century. And Bastion is just the capital of the free states. And there were other cities that were in the game right until very, very close to being published. If you dig around on the blog, you can find them. There's a little reference to them here about smaller cities, but relatively close to when the game was released, I decided that I wanted Bastion to be the city. And I haven't actually used the phrase in here, I don't think, but like Hub of Mankind was kind of the phrase for a while, but then it soon became, in my sort of explanation, the only city that matters. So there are other cities, but I'm not going to write about them. And they all pale in comparison to Bastion. So yeah, it's a slightly different Bastion to the Electric Bastion. A little bit darker, really. You know, you've got mobs with hanged corpses and otherworldly imposters. And it's a bit more kind of gritty, I guess, than what's in Electric Bastion. And you've still got the underground, which is kind of... It's largely unchanged from what's in Electric Bastion, but it hasn't got the weird time and space bending element in there yet. It is literally the underground. It's literally like a series of tunnels. And then Deep Country is kind of the closest to what it still is. I haven't quite started to get this idea of the further you go, it's like going back in time. So it is kind of like just the normal countryside around the city. The whole geography of the world is a little bit more mundane. So Bastion is not necessarily an infinite city here, or rather, effectively infinite. Like it feels much more like a real normal city, and the countryside and the underground are a bit more mundane. Whereas in Electric Bastion, and the world's geography is a lot more weird. So Bastion is kind of effectively infinite, and the underground doesn't follow the rules of space and time. And Deep Country is like time travel as you go through it. The other cities are referenced here. And then one of the biggest changes, the Golden Lands. Let me check in the old version here. Are they called? Yeah, they are called the Golden Lands here. So the Golden Lands would kind of eventually, I started calling them the Far Lands. Well, I can't remember which one came first. Bizarre ruins filled with riches and hidden beneath unnatural landscapes. This distant continent is barely mapped and seems to stretch on forever with increasingly alien life and surroundings. So I knew that I wanted it to be kind of like, this is where a lot of the sci-fi weirdness is coming from. And this is a place you can go to experience some more of the sci-fi weirdness. There are references to like the stars and, visitors from the stars, and this kind of the sense that the stars are important and there are like there's alien influence on the world. But the Golden Lands are there as a kind of way of putting it on the surface as well. And the reason that I got rid of it is because, well, two reasons really. The first is that I wanted to explore the idea of the stars as places you could go. And as you've discovered in Electric Bastion Land, it's left very vague in there. But the idea is that there are beings that have come from the stars and you could potentially go there. That is now what I'm looking at in Intergalactic Bastion Land, whenever that ends up taking shape. But here, I didn't like having the weird alien stuff be in two places. I like the alien stuff in one place, like in the stars. The other reason is the Golden Lands and this whole thing about going out to ruins on a distant continent. It's just a little bit too like rooted in our own history of like going to the New World and like looting ruins, and it's not really what I wanted in this game. I didn't want the game to feel too much like, I didn't want Bastion to feel specifically like it was like, this is a pastiche of London. And I didn't want the Golden Lands to get misinterpreted as being like, well, this is a pastiche of the Americas or other sort of places to go and loot. I didn't really want that in there. It wasn't really fitting of what I wanted the theme of the game to be. So yeah, it's a double reason why it's gone. The Polar Ocean is still in the book. There's something about the polar mists. There's still a bit in Electric Bastion about this. But originally there was a lot more, there were many more sections of the world, but again, much like the rules, I just kind of chopped off the ones I didn't like. So the Polar Ocean is still in there, but it's not a thing that's kind of laid out quite so clearly. And I think, seeing as we have reached the sample content, no, you know what? Let's press on, because I don't think I'm going to be talking about these for too long. So there's no point like leaving it for another one. I'm going to go through the sample content very quickly. If you want to play this, then maybe don't watch this bit of the stream. I'm not going to dig into every sort of room, but the real beauty of this section is you've got the one piece of artwork by me in the book. And I kind of cringe when I see it, but I think it's I would say it's serviceable as a map, but I don't even think it is like especially serviceable. There's lots of weird bits where it's not massively clear. It's not too bad, but there's a few like weird bits where it's a bit unclear. But yeah, it's that's the one piece of artwork by me in the book, so I can credit myself as a published artist. So the Iron Coral was meant to kind of function as a dungeon that you could run a satisfying session in like a few hours, go in, get some treasure, or narrowly escape death and get out. But I wanted to have enough little branching routes and stuff in here that you could potentially go back. So it's one session, 2 sessions maybe, and I very much like the idea of starting the characters here. And the first game, you start them at the entrance to the dungeon, which sounds very basic now, but at the time it felt a lot more like that wasn't happening all the time, like in games of D&D that I was playing. So it would have been 3rd edition, I think, at the time. Maybe we'd gone into 4th edition. I can't remember the exact timings of when 4th edition came out, but certainly my experience up to the development of Into the Odd was with 3rd edition D&D, and it felt like the games I was playing there, it was always starting with that cliche of like, you start in a tavern, or more commonly, like you're starting like on a journey to somewhere interesting, like you're on a baggage train or you're on a boat, and that kind of slow build. And maybe I'm impatient, but I like starting session 1 at the door to a dungeon. I think it's not going to work for everyone in every situation, but I think it's a good, safe bet. So the other thing I'm very happy with is this kind of layout of having the contents of the room be quite sort of tersely laid out. Again, I'm not going to claim to have invented that. I definitely read about it on some blog somewhere, but I definitely took it to heart and kind of ran with it. So yeah, the Iron Coral I think still holds up as a decent dungeon. The Fallen Marsh, I hear less about this. I hear people all the time saying that they should run the Iron Coral and like, oh yeah, I like the Iron Coral. I don't really hear much about the Fallen Marsh, but I feel like it's quite fun. It's got quite a lot of atmosphere. I like the weather effect. It's got some interesting random encounters. I like Swarmface. See, this is where I started to like get into the frame of mind of saying, hoping that the reader will just work it out. If I just say Swarmface, talks in a gibberish buzz tongue, points in the right direction if asked. Like, in my head, that's crystal clear what I'm trying to say. Like, yeah, Swarmface, right? You can picture what I'm saying. So I'm imagining like a swarm of flies that like takes the form of a face. I don't know if I was thinking about like, I don't know what's inspired me on that, but yeah, there's quite a few things like that where you're kind of having to work out a bit for yourself. Yeah, Sean Smith says, there's still a lot of OSR games I play where we spend the first half of the session hearing about the dungeon we signed up for. I think it's different. I think if you are playing an especially long game, so if we're settling down for like the whole afternoon, and I know that we've got a long time, I might be happier with a slow build-up. Or if we know that we're going to be playing in the same group for like 12 weeks, which for me is a long campaign. But most of the time I'm playing the game, it's like I don't know whether this is going to be a one-shot. It might grow into a campaign, but most of my games start off as one-shots. And, you know, get to it is my advice. But yeah, I think the Fallen Marsh is worth a visit. I think there's some interesting stuff in here. And there's just some weird stuff. Where's the one that I like? I like the ape man. I like the dog statue. Hero the terrier. Killer of Muck Bear. I don't think the Muck Bear appears in here as a trap, as a monster. But yeah, there's some weird stuff in here, and you're not going to see it all in one journey. And then Hope's End Port. So Hope's End for a while was a bit more generic, just like a port, and then I kind of liked to lead into the whole like out of season seaside resort idea, which is something I probably overused because I think I've used that somewhere else as well. But But yeah, the fact that it's got an amusement arcade that's closed down immediately makes it more interesting than just being like, it was just the last port of the north previously, so it was just like a boring place, which isn't great. People have asked me like, well, why, if Bastion is the only city that matters, why does none of the sample content take place in Bastion? And I don't have an answer for that, to be honest with you. I think at the time of writing this book, Bastion wasn't quite the sort of star of the show that it is now for me. Bastion was just one element of the world, and it might be a place that you sort of work up to going to, or it might just be a place that you're from but you don't really go to, because there's not much in here about running like a city adventure. And that was one of the big driving points for Electric Bastion, was having more guidance on how do you actually run a city-based game. But yeah, you got some fun characters. And then the Odd Pendium. So this probably really did help get people interested in the book, because people, especially at the time, like I'm talking about it like it's like a different era, but in this stage of like the OSR, and it was a bit more of a clear identity at the time for like for a game. To say it was an OSR game, it was a bit clearer what you meant. Now it's all become very, very muddy. Admittedly, Into the Odd was perhaps already a little bit muddy in terms of like, is it OSR, because it's not really a retro clone. But it's a very hazy term to use now. But at the time there was a lot of appetite for random tables. There still is, obviously, but like D100 tables especially. But I have done the kind of the cop-out thing here of having a D100 table but there's not 100 entries, which I think is weak. That's weak of me, and I do apologise for that. I like this Bastion's Cast 1000. It's probably the most useful table in the book. So let's do some. That's not what I need. Here we go. Google, whoever runs the Google Dice Roller, you need to sort out your. There's no D100 option here. So what do we have? Can I do like a few? So we'll treat them as like first digit, second digit. So 17. Emmett or Emma. We'll go with Emma. 9. Emma Chop. Their occupation, 44. Emma Chop is a life servant, and their capability is 5. They're a boringly dependable life servant. What is their mana? So their mana is 76. Their mana is they are quite ugly. This is not painting like a particularly glamorous person. 41. Their connection. They are the spouse of somebody else that we have a connection to. So somebody's spouse that we know is called Emma Chop, and she is a kind of ugly life servant. That doesn't paint a great picture, but this was to try and like, especially the mana side of it, I wanted to try and like, rather than have descriptions where it's like you roll for your NPC and it's like, okay, they are slightly taller than average height, they have green eyes and long hair, and they are well dressed. I wanted it to be more like sort of archetypal descriptions, so like naive teenager, nice but dim, beaky boar, big fat glutton, attractive dullard. It tells you more about the character with less, rather than me having to like go through and like have like a load of personality traits that don't fit together. Oh, and then whatever happened to them? So what happened to Emma Chop? 13. Oh, she died in an uprising. Well, that's good, because she wasn't a very interesting character. What's this street like? So point of interest and atmosphere. So you might have a dust university. Again, you would roll 2 D100. An artistic canal dock. So this is kind of where the setting does lie. And rather than try have like loads of advice on how to run a city game, I sort of relied on things like this. Like, what's this street like? What's the quickest route across town? Bastion's great businesses. Insane council decisions. So this this is an example of what I do kind of like to do, but I also kind of hate it. I said about stunt casting. This is kind of like, I don't want to say it's like stunt casting. It's like, I'm trying to think of like an analogy, but I'll just explain what it is instead, and hopefully that will make sense. What it is it's a table that's probably not going to get that much use at the table. So insane council decisions. So what is the council doing that's weird, and what's the general public reaction to it? You would need to be in quite a specific situation to actually want to roll on this, but it serves more as a flavor thing. So you look at this and you're like, wow, so when I'm running the game, so this is the kind of thing the council's doing, and the general public reaction is, it could be anywhere. It could be like they support it, there's riots. Yeah, it's more to like paint a picture of the world rather than to actually see much use. Yeah, Technoscald says number 7 is definitely insane. I don't know why that is in there, because there's like this is a whole like blog topic for me to eventually write about at some point when I can get my thoughts straight. But I like to think I tackle this a little bit in the very, very last page of the addendum in Electric Bastionland, where I talk about how much I want to represent a certain time period of the world in a game without necessarily representing all the values that go with that time period. So I guess this implies that same-sex marriage is normally legal in Bastion, but it's a representing that in the game is something I like to. I don't know. It's kind of like show don't tell. I need to think about my words very carefully when I phrase this, because it's about creating a city that feels like it's of its time, but I also don't want people to have to deal with the kind of crap that they're dealing with now, and people that have dealt with historically. So it's a very difficult topic for me to explain. But ordinarily, I probably wouldn't put something like that in, because I would want to sort of get that message across in different ways. I'm being very vague. I'm not hiding any sort of weird thoughts here. I hope it's pretty clear. But I'm going to move on from that because I'm making an idiot out of myself. The creature generator, however, is very useful. This is much more something that's going to actually get used at play, and I've had some good creatures come out of this in the past. What's Beyond the Darkness? This is kind of your underground generator, if you like. And then you want to talk more about like stunt casting, or like putting something in there just to show the type of game I'm trying to make. I eat the stuff. Wasn't there I push the button? No, I think I push the button was in a different like little free thing that I did. There was an I push the button table. I eat the stuff. This is like the opposite of what I said about the council decisions one. This is one that actually comes in use at the table very often. There's lots of times when you need this because the players have said, "Oh, what can I smell this weird thing I found? Like, what does it taste like?" So yeah, it's good to have this one on hand. So that is Into the Odd. I hope you've all enjoyed that deep dive into the Odd. I am thinking about like other games that I've done, and I might try and like round out this sort of deep dive series by looking at some other games. I know that I've done them for Electric Bastionland, Grimlight is still too much in flux for me to really do a deep dive on it yet. I did a video looking at Void Heist. Any other games that I have, I'm kind of like sufficiently ashamed of them that I might not want to do a deep dive. But it might be something that I look at doing and kind of go back and see if there's things to be salvaged from in there. But we'll see. In case you haven't worked it out, I'm basically doing these streams like 1 week at a time. There's no grand plan here. However, I can reveal there is I'm gonna stop mid promo because Ray Donato has hit the nail on the head, because the swarm face thing, I think that was directly inspired by those fish in Finding Nemo that form a face. I think that may have been like the direct influence for that, now I think about it. So yeah, I think you're right. That's taken directly from Finding Nemo. There's always somewhere in the back of my head, like the genesis of where it came from. It's often sort of stuck back there. So what I was trying to say before I was very kindly reminded about that is there is going to be an actual play, hopefully coming up soon, of Electric Bastion. I'm going to be running a game. It's going to be on another stream, but I'll be hosting a stream on here. But as you know, my poor computer does not cope well with having multiple people on a stream at the same time. So somebody else is going to host the stream, but I'm going to run a game very soon. There'll be details of that coming out. Other than that, on Friday this week, I am still going to be doing a Grimlight, a bit more Grimlight testing of the solo scenarios in Grimlight. And next Tuesday, I am always open to suggestions on what to do for the more Bastionland based stream. If you have suggestions, you can throw them at me on Twitter at Bastionland. You can support me on Patreon, where I'm really going to listen to your contributions. I believe that's Patreon/Bastionland. All these links are available at bastionland.com. And especially if you want to get involved with talking about the streams, the Bastionland Discord server is the place to be. So I believe that's everything. So until Friday, if you're joining me for Grimlight, or Tuesday if you're waiting for the next Bastionland stream, hope you enjoyed tonight's stream and stay safe.